Today I'm going to show you basic stitches, both right-handed, left-handed, and English or throwing, and continental or picking. So we're going to see both knits and purls both ways and in both hands. If you're a beginner, I really recommend that you start with the English or the throwing method, and then if you are perhaps a crocheter transitioning to knitting, start with the Continental and see how that feels, but also try English. All right, now let's get into the stitches. To begin with an English in the right hand, insert your working needle, wrap the yarn counterclockwise, making sure they go between your needles. You want to tension that a little bit. Then pull that strand you just wrapped around through, and then pull that stitch you inserted into off the left needle. Now don't worry yet about your tension because that's going to be fixed, but insert into the next stitch what we call knitwise. So the points are pointing the same direction. Wrap the yarn counterclockwise. You might want to hold that a little bit to introduce a little bit of tension. And then pull that loop you just made through the loop you've inserted into, which is a stitch, and then pull the stitch you inserted into off the left needle. Okay, again, insert knitwise, so your points will again be pointing the same direction. Wrap the yarn around counterclockwise, pull that loop through the loop you just inserted into, and pull the old stitch off. There is a nursery rhyme video that I made, which I will link to here and also in the description. So again, insert knitwise, wrap your yarn around counterclockwise, pull the loop you just made through that loop that is on your needle, and then pull it off the left needle. So that's what your knit stitches should look like. Always make sure also that your yarn is in the back when you are knitting and in the front when you're purling. So now I'm going to show you the purling method in English, again with the throwing method. You're going to insert purlwise, again making sure your yarn is in front. So, and that's knitwise, and this is purlwise, so it is the opposite from knitwise. Okay, and then you are going to wrap your yarn around your needle, again counterclockwise, peek that loop through on the back side, and pull off the old stitch. I'm sorry that this is off screen. Sometimes I get a little bit not good with my framing. And then, all right, insert again purlwise, again that's opposite of knitwise, and wrap your yarn around your needle counterclockwise, peek that loop through. This is sort of a scooping motion you're going to make with your needles, and pull off the old stitch. Now if your stitches are uneven, don't worry yet. You're really wanting to get the motion down. Insert purlwise, wrap counterclockwise, pull that loop through on the other side. I'm going to show you here. And it might be right on the tip of your needle, so don't worry too much. If it's right on the tip of your needle, just push that working needle forward, and that will help you retain that loop. Okay, and now pull that old stitch off, and that is the purl stitch. Okay, so again, inserting purlwise means that your needle tips are going to be pointing in opposite directions. If you need a little assist from your other hand to push that needle through, then absolutely do that. Eventually you will not have to do that. Okay, and that is purling using the English method. Now I'm going to show you knitting and purling the Continental method, right-handed. So you're going to insert into the stitch knitwise, use your needle to wrap the yarn around, pull that loop through, see how it's on the tip of my needle, just push that working needle, that if you're right-handed is going to be the one on your right, and then pull off the old stitch. Again, insert knitwise, wrap the yarn around your needle. So you're really using your needle to do the wrap and not your fingers as you do with the English method. Pull that loop through and pull the old stitch off. Again, insert knitwise, wrap the yarn around your needle, pull the loop through, push. That push is really important to ensure your stitches are the right size. If you're forming stitches on the tips of your needles, they're going to be too small. All right, wrap the yarn around, pull the loop through, and pull the old stitch off. You can use both your needles to increase the size of the original loop, that's the stitch you're inserted into, to be able to help give you more room to work into. I just undid this one so I can show you a little bit how to do some purl stitches. Now insert purlwise, again we have our yarn in front. We're going to use our index finger to do the wrapping. So push that stitch down, that yarn down, pull the other loop through, and then pull the old stitch off. Again, yarn in front, insert into that stitch purlwise, use your index finger to wrap your yarn, and then peek that other loop through, and then grab that old stitch and pull it off your needle. If your tension is high, you may not be able to pull that stitch off the needle easily, so you may need to use your other fingers to wiggle it off. But that's actually a clue that your tension is off. Okay, last stitch, we're going to insert purlwise, wrap, and then pull through, and then push, and that is the last stitch of the row. I'm going to show you in a little bit how to deal with that loose stitch. It's very normal to have that very loose stitch at the end of a row when you're knitting or purling, so don't worry too much about that. There's a couple of ways to deal with that. One of them is to make the subsequent stitch, so the first stitch in the next row, and pull that very, very, very tight, so that compensates for the looseness of that last stitch, or you can slip stitch the first stitch. Now I'm going to show you an alternate method for continental purling. Insert purlwise, and then you're going to put the yarn between the needles, and then you're going to wrap the yarn around that stitch, pull the loop through. Again, I'm going to show this to you again. So usually, typically the yarn is in front when we're purling, but we're going to put it between our needles, pull that loop through the old stitch, and then pull the old stitch off. Again, insert into the stitch purlwise, yarn between the needles, pull that loop through and around, and pull it off the old stitch. This does orient your stitches the alternate direction, which you'll hopefully be able to see here in a little bit. so that the left leg of the stitch is the one forward, and usually, typically, the right leg is one forward. This will give you another perspective on it. So yarn between the two needles and then pull that loop through. Hopefully you can see that. And then pull it off. Again, insert into the stitch, yarn between the two needles, pull that loop through. I'm sorry, this is not as visible as I could make it, but here's another perspective, hopefully, that will make it a little bit more visible for you. We're doing it kind of upside down. Okay, so we're pulling that loop through the other stitch toward the back of the work. Okay, so that's what it'll look like in front, that's what it looks like in back. And then pull the old stitch off. So it looks exactly the same as the other stitches, it's just formed slightly differently. And again, it will orient your stitches with the left leg in the front instead of the right. So when you knit, that means that you will have to knit through the back loop. Okay, now a couple more demonstrations. Okay, I'm going to do this in kind of slow motion and then pull that off, and there you go. So purls always look like knits on the opposite side of the work. Okay, and again, peek that loop through and pull it through and pull the old stitch off. So I'm going to show you how that is to purl into those stitches. So you see that the left leg is forward, which is the opposite way if you purl than the other method. So this is what it means to knit through the back loop. You're going to take the back loop. So it looks like so that instead of inserting purl knitwise that way, this is the knitwise way in this instance. And if you notice, the points are pointing two different directions. So pull that back leg, or you could of course move that forward and reorient the stitches, but I think that's always too much trouble. So that's how you would knit those kinds of stitches through the back loop. Now onto left-handed stitches. So I'm going to show this to you in the same order. So in this case, our working needle will be our left needle. So everything is almost the same, except left-handed stitches will be oriented slightly differently on the needles. Okay, we insert knitwise and wrap the yarn around the needle clockwise. And we take that loop and peek it through the loop we just made, or through the loop we just inserted into, and pull it off the needle. Sorry, that's off the frame. Okay, I'm going to show you that again. This tail is kind of getting in my way. You can use a bread tab to resolve that, so just wrap it around the bread tab a few times and it'll get it out of your way. Okay, insert again knitwise. Wrap your yarn around clockwise. So that means between the needles. Sometimes it is a little fiddly. So wrap your yarn around clockwise, pivot and pull that loop through that you just made, and pull the old loop, the old stitch off the other needle. So that's in this case the right needle. Okay, insert again knitwise, wrap clockwise, peek that loop through the stitch you're inserted into. This is a slightly different perspective on it, so you can see. Pull that loop through, then pull that old stitch off. Now remembering to keep our yarn in back while we're knitting. So insert knitwise, wrap clockwise, so go between your needles and around your working needle, which in this case is our left needle, and then pull that loop through, and then push and pull the old stitch off of your right needle. When I say the stitches are oriented slightly differently, you may notice that in this case the left part of the stitch is toward the front, and when you're knitting right-handed, the right part of the stitch is what's presenting toward the front. Okay, so I'm trying to show you where the loop peeks through, and then where the old stitch is still on, and then you can just pull that off with your working needle. Okay, we're going to do some purl stitches now. Again, this is still purling English style with our left hand. Insert purlwise, wrap again clockwise, peek that stitch through, and pull your old stitch off. In this case, we typically want to use the working needle to pull the stitch off of the other needle. Okay, insert purlwise, wrap clockwise. This is another perspective on it so you can see with our working needle, and then pull that loop through toward the back. This is typically where beginners lose their stitch, but do try to persist. Again, you're kind of making a scooping motion underneath the other needle, and then pull that off. And if you need to work close to your tips, that's fine, but just make sure that you always do that extra little push after a stitch to make sure it's fully formed. Okay, insert and wrap clockwise. I'm trying to show you that so my hand's not blocking that. Okay, and here's where you want to introduce a little bit of tension so that you can keep that loop. If you keep losing your loops, it's because you're not putting proper tension on them as they're being pulled through. And pull through the other loop, push, that's the push I was talking about with forming your stitches correctly, and pull off the other needle. Okay, again, insert knitwise. Again, if yours are a little bit tight, this might have been a stitch I made a little bit too tightly on while I was casting on. Okay, insert, wrap clockwise. Okay, peek that loop through, push toward the back, pull that old stitch off. I did not do the push here, which is what I should have done, but that is okay. Insert purlwise, wrap clockwise, wrap clockwise, pull through toward the back, that's that peeking through, and then push and pull the other old stitch off. I'm going to show you a few more examples just so you can really see these other ones. Sometimes if you have too much tension, your wrap will actually fall off your working needle, so that's something to also be aware of. Tensioning is a whole other different topic, and I will include a link to the way I tension for crocheting, but that can also be helpful in this instance. So here's a few more purl stitches. Sorry, they're off screen. And then one last one to show you exactly how that is. I'm a little shaky here because it's not my natural handedness, so I am a righty, but I wanted to be able to show those to you. Now I'm going to show you Continental left-handed. All right, insert, use the needle to wrap the stitch around your needle, then peek that loop through and pull the old stitch off. And sometimes if you're not working so close to your needle or your tip, it's going to be a little hard. Again, insert knitwise, use your needle to wrap your yarn around, peek that loop through, pull the old stitch off. Insert knitwise, wrap with your needle, peek that through. Sorry, this is off the frame, and then pull that other stitch off. Again, insert knitwise, wrap. Now again, we're also wrapping clockwise again, and pull that little loop through. Again, this is where most beginners lose that loop that they've formed. If you do that, that's okay. Sometimes it's actually a matter of both too much and too little tension, so just do be aware of and notice if and when you lose your loop, what is happening. If your tension's too loose or too tight, that will help you. Okay, and now I'm going to peek that loop through. Oops, see, I lost my loop there. Insert, use the needle to wrap the yarn, again clockwise, peek it through. Sorry, that's not quite as visible on camera. So as you are bringing that loop forward, you're making kind of a J-shaped motion. So insert, wrap clockwise, J-shaped scoop motion, push the needle through, and pull the old stitch off. Again, insert, wrap, pull old stitch through, or new stitch through, excuse me, new through the old, and pull the old one off. I think I accidentally split something, so that's why I was fixing that right there. Now onto some purl stitches. We're going to yarn forward. Oops. Okay. Now we're going to yarn forward, insert purlwise, and this is a little awkward for me, but then we're going to again use our index finger to wrap the yarn clockwise like that, and then make our scoop motion toward the back to peek that loop through and pull the old stitch off the needle. On to our next stitch, we're going to insert into the stitch, use our right index finger to wrap clockwise, peek through, making again that sort of J-shaped motion, and pulling the old stitch off. If you have that wrap sort of or the old stitch to come over like that, you can just use your finger like I did to pull it over the working needle, and that does count as a stitch made. All right, let's finish these last two. Again, insert into the stitch, purlwise, wrap with your right index finger. Oops, got that the wrong direction. There we go. Peek that through. Yeah, if you lose it, both needles need to be in the stitch in order for the stitch to be formed. So if you're losing it like I am here, just reinsert the needle and restart your stitch forming process. We're going to insert into the stitch, again, wrap clockwise, pull that other loop through, pull the old stitch off, again, insert into the stitch purlwise, wrap clockwise, peek through with a J shape scoop, and pull the old stitch off. Now here are a few more examples just so you can see it a little bit more easily. And there you go. I hope you learned something fun today, seeing all the stitches in both hands. And I will again link those nursery rhymes so you can see those for both the knit and purl stitches. And happy knitting!